Welcome back, everyone. Ready to dive into a new topic. Today, we're talking all things whiskey.
A fascinating world to explore.
It really is. And by the end of this deep dive, you'll be able to impress your friends with your whiskey knowledge. You've always been a little curious about whiskey, haven't you?
I'd say so. There's just something so intriguing about it.
Right. Maybe there's a special occasion coming up, or hey, maybe you just want to sound like a whiskey connoisseur at your next happy hour. Whatever the reason, we've got you covered.
I'm excited to break it all down.
Me too. And to guide us through this world of single malts and smoky finishes, we have a true whiskey aficionado with us.
Well, I've always been fascinated by the process. Each step, from grain to glass, adds something special to the final product.
That's what makes it so interesting. But before we get lost in a whirlwind of tasting notes, let's make sure we're all on the same page.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
We don't want anyone feeling lost in the world of Angel, Share, and Pete.
Exactly. Okay, imagine this. You're at a bar, ready to order a dram that's whiskey slang for a serving, by the way.
I like it.
So you're ready to order that dram, but the menu is speaking a language you don't quite understand. What are the key things that actually set all these different whiskeys apart?
It really all comes down to three main things. Where it's from, what it's made from, and how it's made. The origin, the grain, and the production process. Those are the pillars of whiskey.
Okay, I'm following you. So let's break down those pillars, starting with origin. You're a big believer that where a whiskey is made massively changes its flavor, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's like wine in that way. Take Scotch whiskey, for instance. Scottish law actually says it has to age for at least 3 years in oak casks, and it's just the baseline.
Really? I had no idea there were actual laws about that.
Oh, yeah, there are very specific regulations, and it goes even deeper than that. A lot of the distilleries, especially those in the Highlands or Speyside, the famous whiskey regions in Scotland, they get their water straight from local springs and rivers.
Wow, so the water source really does matter.
It's huge.
Yeah.
That water's been filtered through peat and granite for centuries, and all those minerals get absorbed, giving the whiskey its unique character.
It's like the terroir we hear about with wine.
Exactly. And it goes beyond the water, too. The climate, the yeast they use, even the air in those old distilleries plays a role. All these little things work together.
That makes so much sense. Okay, so we've got location, location, location. Next up, grain. I know whiskey can be made from different grains, right?
That's right. Barley's the most common, but you've also got corn, rye, wheat. All sorts of grains can be used.
So that must make a huge difference in the taste, right? Like a corn whiskey versus a rye whiskey.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the sweetness of cornbread. That's what corn brings to the table in a whiskey.
Oh, that makes sense.
Bourbon, for example, it's known for its smooth, sweet character, and that's largely thanks to the corn. It's got to be at least 51% corn, according to U.S. regulations.
Wow, I'm starting to see how these little distinctions can make such a big difference in the final product. Okay, we've covered origin, we've covered grain. What about that third pillar you mentioned, production?
This is where things get really interesting. Production covers everything, the stills they use for distilling, how long it ages, and most importantly, the barrels they use.
Oh, the barrels. I've always wondered about those. It's amazing how a wooden container can have such a huge impact on the final taste, right?
It's pretty remarkable. Think of the wood like a big spice rack, slowly infusing the whiskey with its flavors over time. Oak is the go-to, but even then you have variations. American oak, they use that a lot for bourbon. Gives you those notes of vanilla, caramel, sometimes even coconut. European oak, on the other hand, that's more of a sherry cask thing, so you get those dried fruit, nutty, spicy notes.
You're making me want to book a trip to a distillery.
It's an experience, that's for sure.
Okay, so we've got the basics down, the ABCs of whiskey, if you will. But now let's get down to the good stuff. Let's go on a little virtual tasting tour, starting with the OG of whiskey, Scotland.
Passport's ready. We're about to explore the incredible world of Scotch whiskey.
Perfect. Now, I think when most people hear Scotch, they think smoky peat. But there's so much more to it than just that, isn't there?
Oh, absolutely. Scotch whiskey, it's like a world onto itself when it comes to flavor.
Yeah.
Each region has its own personality. If you were actually traveling through Scotland, tasting whiskey along the way, you'd get this whole spectrum of aromas and tastes.
Okay, I like where you're going with this. So we're on our virtual whiskey tour of Scotland. Where are we headed first?
Let's start in the Highlands. Rugged, majestic, it's home to some of the boldest Scotch whiskeys out there.
Okay, I'm ready for a bold whiskey. When I think of the Highlands, I think of, those heather-covered hills, that fresh mountain air. Is the peat influence as strong there as it is in Islay?
It's there, but it's not quite as in-your-face as Islay. Peat's definitely part of the tradition in the Highlands, but it's more of a background note, adding some complexity. You'll get those honey notes, the heather, the malt, and then that subtle smokiness that kind of lingers. It's a whiskey that really reflects the landscape.
Wow, I can almost taste it. So we've experienced the Highlands. Where to next?
Let's hop over to Speyside. Now, Speyside is all about elegance. If the Highlands are a roaring fire, Speyside is like a warm, cozy blanket.
Ooh, I like the sound of that. I've heard Speyside whiskey is described as being fruity, almost dessert-like. Is that accurate?
You could say that. Speyside whiskeys are known for those orchard fruit notes, green apple, pear, and then you've got the honey, vanilla, a touch of floral sweetness. It's partly the region itself, the climate and all that. But they also use a lot of ex-sherry casks for aging in Speyside, and that adds to the sweetness and complexity.
The sherry casks, right. They bring their own flavor to the party.
Exactly. Just imagine. You're having a dram of Speyside whiskey on a chilly evening. You might pick up on pear tart, maybe some almond biscotti, a hint of cinnamon. It's an experience.
You're making it really hard to resist booking a flight right now. Okay, but before we leave Scotland, we have to talk about Islay, right? The peat king.
Ah, Islay, the wild one of the bunch. If you're looking for subtlety, this isn't it. Islay is for those who want a whiskey that's big, smoky, and totally unique.
So we're talking intense peat smoke, salty sea air. What else should our listeners be prepared for with an Islay whiskey?
Imagine standing on the coast of Islay wind in your hair, the smell of the sea all around, and then that aroma of peat smoke carried on the breeze. That's Islay in a nutshell. These whiskeys are often described as having this almost medicinal quality, a bit iodine-like. And then there's the seaweed, the brine, the leather, and that smoky finish that just goes on and on.
I remember the first time I tried an Islay whiskey, it was like nothing I had ever tasted. A total revelation.
It really makes you rethink what whiskey can be.
Totally. Okay, we've covered the Highlands, fallen in love with Speyside, and braved the smoky depths of Islay. I'd say our virtual tour of Scotland has been a success, but we're not done traveling, are we? I think it's time to head west.
Next stop, America. Get ready for a whole other side of whiskey.
All right. We're talking American whiskey now, and I have to say I'm pretty excited to dive into the world of bourbon. All right? We've made it to American whiskey country. I can practically smell the corn mash from here. It's time to talk bourbon.
There's nothing quite like it. Bourbon's a true American original, and it all goes back to corn.
Okay, so walk me through it. How does corn become bourbon?
Well, you see, when those early settlers came over, they realized corn grew really well here. Perfect climate, good soil, and when you got a lot of grain, what do?
Turn it into whiskey.
You got it. They figured out how to ferment it, distill it, age it in those oak barrels. That's the heart of it.
And that's how bourbon was born. But what makes it stand out from just, regular corn whiskey?
It's that combination of factors we've been talking about, but with a bit of American spirit thrown in. Remember how we talked about the 51% corn mash bill?
Yeah, for bourbon.
That's key. That's what gives bourbon that sweetness. But then they age it in new charred oak barrels. And, brand new, only used once, and that's where the magic happens.
The charred oak barrels. You mentioned that before about how the barrel can change the flavor, but how does charring it actually do that?
So picture this. You take a blowtorch to the inside of an oak barrel. The wood sugars caramelize. You get this layer of charcoal, and it acts like a filter. Cleans out impurities as the whiskey ages. But it also releases all these amazing flavors. Vanilla, caramel, spices, blends right in with that corn sweetness.
Wow, so it's like alchemy almost.
It's pretty incredible.
It really is. Okay, so we've got our sweet corn, we've got our charred oak barrels. What else makes bourbon bourbon?
Well, unlike Scotch, which has to age for at least 3 years, bourbon doesn't have a minimum aging requirement. But if you're talking straight bourbon, that has to be aged for at least 2 years in those new charred oak barrels. And trust me, those 2 years make a world of difference.
I bet they do. Okay, you've convinced me I need a bourbon in my life. But American whiskey has more to offer than just bourbon, right? What about rye? I feel like it's having a moment.
Rye is definitely having a resurgence, and for good reason. It's got this boldness, a spiciness that really sets it apart.
So it's like bourbon's more adventurous cousin.
That's a good way to put it. And it all comes back to the grain. Remember how we were talking about different grains giving different flavors? Rye whiskey gets its kick from, rye.
So instead of 51% corn like bourbon, it's 51% rye.
You got it. And that rye is what gives it that spicy, bold character. It's got a real kick to it.
Okay, give me a taste. If bourbon is like a warm slice of pecan pie, what's rye like?
Rye whiskey is more like, imagine a slice of rye bread fresh out of the oven, with some spicy mustard and a bit of peppery salami on top. It's got that boldness, that lingering spice that warms you up.
Wow, I can see why people are rediscovering it. Okay, we're running out of time on our Whiskey World Tour, but we can't forget about Canadian whiskey and Japanese whiskey.
Yeah, absolutely not. Those deserve their own moment in the spotlight.
Let's do a quick trip to Canada first. Canadian whiskey always seems so smooth and easy to drink. What's their secret?
Well, Canadian whiskey is interesting because it's a bit more flexible. It's not as strict as some of the others when it comes to the rules.
What do you mean?
Well, like we talked about with the grain bills and the production methods, some whiskeys have very specific guidelines. Canadian whiskey, it has a bit more freedom. They use rye a lot, but it's not a requirement. And Canadian distillers, they're known for their blending. They're like the masters of blending. They take whiskeys made from different grains, rye, corn, wheat, even barley sometimes, and combine them to make these really smooth, balanced blends.
So it's kind of like the choose-your-own-adventure of whiskey. A little something for everyone.
That's a great way to think about it. And it makes it a really good choice for cocktails, too.
Makes sense. Okay, last but not least, Japan. Japanese whiskey has a special place in my heart. It's just so elegant.
It really is special. Japanese whiskey is a true testament to their dedication to craftsmanship. They took inspiration from Scotch whiskey, but they elevated it, focused on precision, balance, every little detail.
You can taste that care in every sip.
Absolutely. And even though they might be using similar ingredients, similar equipment to Scotch, the result is totally unique. Those layered flavors, you get those floral notes, a bit of orchard fruit, some subtle spice, and then that finish. So smooth and long.
It's like a whiskey meditation.
Oh, love that description.
Well, here we are. We've traveled the world of whiskey, from the Scottish Highlands to the American heartland, from spicy rye to smooth Canadian blends, and ended on the elegance of Japanese whiskey.
And what a journey it's been.
I couldn't agree more. So for our listeners who are feeling inspired to start their own whiskey adventures, what's the best advice you can give them?
Don't be afraid to try new things. Taste everything, ask questions, and figure out what you enjoy. The world of whiskey is huge. There's a perfect dram out there for everyone.
I love that. And on that note, I think it's time for us to raise a glass or a dram to the amazing world of whiskey. Cheers.
Cheers to that.